Let's take a look at the new unveiled rules for the Primaris Astraeus and what this big hovering behemoth can do in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought we'd take a look at the Primaris Astraeus tank with its new full rules now unveiled from Games Workshop. The Imperial Armour Compendium is now out, so we basically have the full Forge World rules for all the factions in the game. I thought that perhaps one of the most interesting ones to take a look at would be just how well the big Primaris Super Heavy is stacking up, now one of the only Forge World options that Space Marines have. As it goes, this tank is a relatively recent one from Forge World. It's only been around since the Primaris Space Marines have, and they only came about at the start of 8th edition. Basically the tank is kind of a repulsor but bigger, those enormous grav plates but taken to the next level, and its lore is basically that it's perhaps the pinnacle of mankind's technology at the moment, a very rare sight on the battlefields of Warhammer 40k, but really quite a powerful heavy lifter when it does show up. The tank itself is basically a massive floating platform for a macro accelerator cannon on the back, and the grav plate technology provides a very suitable way to have it moving around the board, able to keep on hovering inexorably along even as it fires out those massive guns. The tank's protected by some void shields to keep it safe from enemy Titan class weapons, and also sports a whole bunch of secondary weapon systems as well, stobbers, heavy bolters, and either las rippers or plasma weapons on the sponsons. As per most big fancy Forge World things, it does cost an awful lot, £265, €325 or 410 US. Quite a hefty chunk of money there, but I suppose it does take up over a quarter of your army at 2,000 points. As it goes, I think the model is kind of cool. I feel like, as with quite a few of the more recent Primaris things, maybe looks a little bit more generic sci-fi than Warhammer 40k Space Marine perhaps. For the most part, I think it's been received pretty well by the community though. I've seen a lot of people quite enjoy fielding theirs. In general, it's never tended to be the apex competitive thing for Space Marines, but occasionally oddball lists have done well at the odd tournaments, particularly in 9th edition, focusing around certain Iron Hands buffs, which could get a lot of value out of one enormously tough vehicle datasheets. Just with its raw toughness, it could be perhaps impractical to kill, so you basically had to focus on destroying the rest of the enemy army and hope this didn't quite do enough damage to make itself worth it. Let's take a look at the datasheet then, and the Astraeus in 40k 10th edition is 525 points, a great big hovering Primaris Super Heavy, and at that kind of points cost it is going to have to do a serious amount of work to justify itself in your army. On its base stats it moves 10 inches, though it doesn't have fly anymore, so that is going to give it some problems when it's moving around the board. Perhaps one of the biggest issues on this, particularly on things like tournament tables, was that it's just physically too big to fit between certain terrain pieces, and even with the 9th edition fly rules where it could happily move straight over them, it could still have issues. If you can't get the back of the model to the other side of the terrain piece, it basically couldn't move over, so that was still causing problems. Even if it did have fly in 10th edition, that probably wouldn't help too much. Now you need to go up and over terrain pieces rather than kind of ghost across. And I feel like unless you're setting up the table to be a bit more Astraeus friendly, this thing's definitely going to have problems just moving around the board. Might be a bit of a critical issue for it in competitive play. Otherwise, we've got a leadership of 6+, the same as Space Marines, objective control 8, so a little bit less than a standard Imperial Knight, but it's still going to be a big threat when it's hovering on objectives. And in 10th edition, it is Titanic, but it doesn't have that towering keyword. I guess it is a somewhat low profile to the ground. I feel like the absence of towering with the current version of the rules is probably a negative if anything. You're probably not going to be able to hide this very easily behind ruins and terrain and things, but shooting through things like ruin walls with windows I think could have been kind of helpful. Toughness wise, this thing is pretty massive, a huge toughness 12, a 2+ save, 24 wounds and a 5+ invulnerable save. It looks like the void shields have just been rolled into an invulnerable save as opposed to doing individual things, getting rid of individual powerful enemy shots. A bit simpler but maybe a little bit less powerful in 10th edition, given that quite a lot of anti-tank weapons are only AP3 or worse. There's not quite as much running around with AP4, which is what you need to actually force it onto that invul. I guess it is still very nice against melter weapons and certain absolutely massive anti-titan weapons, which this thing probably is going to attract. Toughness wise, it seems to be somewhat similar to, say, one of the Dominus Knights, not a terrible place for it, and it shouldn't be too hard to get to cover save as well with 10th edition's terrain rules, provided you can keep just a little bit of this tank behind some bit of terrain, then you're getting a cover save, and that's going to be pretty big with 2+ save armour. It does degrade as well, but like many things in 40k, maybe not quite as painfully as before, only getting -1 wound when you're less than 8 wounds left, plus a little bit less objective control as well, kind of standard for other super heavies. Finally, the invulnerable save is only against ranged attacks, not against combat, again kind of working a little bit similar to the Knight Ion Shields there. I feel like realistically though, the 2+ save again is going to make that not that relevant most of the time, and at times that it does, you could maybe use Armour of Contempt for 1 CP to worsen enemy AP. For its damage output, the main weapon are the twin macro accelerator cannons. These ones have got a new profile of 12 shots, hitting on a 3+, strength 9, AP -1 and damage 3, and it gets both sustained hits and twin linked as well. It is going to be pretty much guaranteed to stack a whole load of saves on your target, though the AP -1 is perhaps a little bit underwhelming. Just for an average burst of shooting with that, you'd average around about 5 dead Space Marine intercessors, 3 dead Terminators, 11 wounds to a Rhino, or 6 wounds to a Land Raider, though all of that does go down a fair bit if the targets get cover, which isn't really all that hard to do in 10th edition. Space Marines do have a couple of ways of boosting AP though, which are probably going to be very relevant to this, which we'll get onto in just a second. Otherwise, for the side sponsons, you've either got the Las Rippers or the Plasma Eradicators. At first glance, these seem kind of well balanced. The Las Rippers are basically the same as Land Raider style Las cannons, but with a 36-inch range, 2 shots, strength 12, and d6+1, exactly what you want to be taking out enemy armor with. The Plasma Eradicators get slightly more shots at d6 shots apiece and the blast keyword. They're strength 8, AP 3, and damage 3 though, so are far better suited to killing things like elite infantry and Terminators, and they'll struggle a bit more against vehicles punching up on a 5+ to wound. I feel like both of those seem kind of fine at first glance, depends on whether you need a bit more anti-tank or anti-infantry firepower in your life. Otherwise it looks like it gets 2 of those Iron Hell Stubbers, another 12 shots at close range at least, 1 Storm Bolter, and then either a choice of twin Heavy Bolters or twin Las Cannons on the hull. I feel like I'd probably be more tempted by the twin Las Cannons given the story has a fair few anti-infantry shots, but again either seems kind of fine. Overall definitely feels like a damage dealing piece that your opponent can't really afford to ignore. If it can stay alive and shooting, it probably is going to add up enough to pay off its points in a few turns at least. Finally, for its unit ability, it's got one called Suppression Fire, which is basically the same one as the Space Marine Suppressors. Perhaps not quite as enormously exciting on this one compared with the Suppressor Squad, where you could get multiple copies for this points cost. Basically, a unit hit by that macro accelerator cannon gets a -1 to hit, though I guess it might be a little bit less exciting than the suppressors, as they're probably not going to kill their target quite as reliably, whereas this I feel like you might have a reasonable chance of wiping out a unit quite a lot when you fire it, and then that -1 to hit is going to be kind of redundant. Definitely doesn't hurt though if you're firing it into a great big enemy heavy hitter. Hitting it hard and then debuffing it in the next turn seems kind of nice, so maybe in the early game it seems like that's quite a good gun to whittle down the enemy's toughest targets and try and wipe out everything else with your smaller guns. Within the Space Marine army there's quite a lot of things that can make the Astraeus a little bit stronger. Oath of Moment definitely is going to be helpful for just about any Space Marine firepower units. It's definitely going to be very relevant on a lot of the guns, though maybe just a tiny bit less useful on that macro accelerator cannon as it's got twin links built in. Might just mean that the small arms are perhaps better fired at your Oath of Moment target, and perhaps divide fire with the macro accelerator against something that you couldn't mark with Oath, as just in comparison it's not getting quite as an efficient a buff. The combat doctrines from the Gladius task force look kind of interesting. Devastator Doctrine for an advanced move I think is going to be quite relevant with that one to try and get line of sight. And so might Tactical Doctrine with fallback and shoot as well. You certainly can just keep on blazing away in combat with these great big Titanic units, but it's best not to get the -1 to hit if you can avoid it. So falling back and shooting could be quite good. You could even still charge in to tie up the same enemy unit again if you wanted to. As an enormous great big vehicle, any buffs or synergies that you could put on it are probably going to have about as much value as anywhere else in the army. Perhaps a really obvious one just might be the Tech Marine for a very easy +1 to hit on an absolutely huge unit, plus a little bit of repairs don't hurt as well. Seems like a Tech Marine could be fairly easily justifying the points there. Otherwise, Space Marines just have really quite a lot of things to amp up various damage boosts from shooting. Perhaps some of the easiest ones to declare are the Incursors marking a target for a +1 to hit, very relevant on an enormous gun platform that hits on a 3. Perhaps the Storm Speeder Hellstrike might be even more important though. The Macroplasma really suffers from having lowish AP, so getting that up to AP -2 with a Hellstrike seems absolutely excellent. Or you could use that Phobos Lieutenant for reroll 1s against one unit on an objective. Maybe feels a bit less practical than the Incursors and the Hellstrike though. If your army list is going all in on the really big heavy models, then you could have Gilliman for his Oath and Stratagems as well. Might be playing quite a low model count Space Marine army when you get to that stage though. Probably out of these I feel like it's almost certainly worth having either Incursors or Tech Marine on the board. Just getting +1 to hits with this sort of weapon is really quite cool, and the Hellstrike just seems excellent for extra AP on the Macroplasma. Otherwise, for stratagems, these Space Marine ones are really quite de-restricted now. You can use quite a lot of stratagems on really big powerful things for exactly the same cost. Just for 40k in general, Overwatch is going to be monumentally terrifying on this kind of thing, particularly with the macro accelerator cannon where you get sustained hits 1 on the 6s. kind of doubles the value of Overwatch on that, and then any hits that you do get to re-roll the wounds as well. Seems pretty much guaranteed to be taking big chunks out of enemy units, or perhaps even killing certain squads outright. Otherwise, just about any of the other stratagems are good. 1 command point for Armour of Contempt to worsen enemy AP by 1 is great when you've got a 2+ save and a massive vehicle to tank with. Tank Shock's usable enough if you just need a few more mortal wounds in the charge phase. For 1 command point, you could flex your doctrines into advancing and shooting if that makes the difference between getting line of sight or not. That's going to be well worth it if it's the difference between this guy getting line of sight on the target it needs to, and either shooting nothing or something else. And on the turn that you've got the Devastator Doctrine, you can get 1 command point for Ignores Cover and extra AP. And again, as with the Stormspeeder Hail Strike, if you get the extra AP on the Macro Accelerator, it just becomes a fantastically general purpose weapon. I think you could even stack the 2 if you really wanted, so potentially getting AP3 on the great big main cannon. Ignores Cover is a value all of itself as well in 10th edition, where so many things can get cover saves so easily. Obviously, most of that is aimed at the Gladius task force. You can absolutely take this for the other Space Marine chapters like Black Templars and Dark Angels and friends. Deathwatch have got access to some very easy shooting buffs with their special issue ammunition types, which is kind of weird that can apply to such great big vehicles like this though. The Black Templars will make it more durable with a 6+ Feel No Pain type save. That's really quite good on something that you're probably going to struggle to hide too much. And Dark Angels, maybe one of the most interesting things could actually be their Dark Shroud. Getting both stealth and the benefit of cover on this thing is kind of monstrous and makes it ridiculously hard to remove with that enormous profile. The Talon Master's probably a bit sad that this thing doesn't get fly as well, as Ignores Cover just innately would have been kind of good. Overall, I feel like the Astraeus has probably got the stats enough to make itself justifiable, particularly with enormous great big Space Marine damage boosts, easy access to +1 to hit, Ignores Cover, and extra AP from multiple sources all seems great for a low AP but very general purpose main gun, and the side sponsons just pack massive threat in their own right as well. I feel like any big vehicle that's just got so much concentrated wounds is always going to be a bit intimidating to face down. If you do a lot of damage but don't kill it, then you've potentially wasted a lot of turns firepower and then get hit back just as hard as the turn before pretty much. I definitely feel like if you're taking one, it's probably worth thinking about building the extra AP into the list somehow, either using Devastator Doctrine with the extra AP or picking up a Hail Strike. I guess for competition, it'll be competing against other Astartes shooting units. Realistically, it's not going to do anywhere near as much damage as the same points invested in those rather godly Primaris Desolators at the moment. Obviously, they're very different things though, with a lot more Ignores line of sight and not one big tough vehicle. It is definitely going to face competition from doing things differently though. Otherwise, for Space Marine vehicles, the same points in say Gladiator Lancers could provide some excellent anti-tank, and for Super Heavies in Space Marine list, it will now be competing against Allied Knights as well. Something like Canis Rex for 405 points also brings a massive great meaty threat to the table, with a bit more of a mix between range and melee. The Knight Crusader also brings some pretty massive firepower to the table, though I feel like probably the Astraeus outcompetes that, even if it does cost a bit more. Just having access to the Space Marine Oath of Moment and the other easy damage buffs that you can get in the army, I think probably make it win out. Overall, on the datasheet it does seem pretty fun, but I think, like I said earlier, it might well struggle practically with any sort of dense terrain tables, as you just can't really physically move the thing around. Not unless you've got a table that's specifically set up to make sure this thing has adequate movement lanes. For that reason, probably a little bit more strong in casual games as opposed to competitive ones. Let me know your thoughts though. What do you make of the great big Primaris Super Heavy? Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, or you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.